Lives of the Engineers, George and Robert Stephenson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information, or to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording read by Andy Minter. Lives of the Engineers, George and Robert Stephenson, by Samuel Smiles. Bid harbours open, public ways extend, bid temples worthier of God ascend, bid the broad arch the dangerous flood contain, the mole projected break the roaring main, back to his bounds their subject sea command, and roll obedient rivers through the land. These honours peace to happy Britain brings, these are imperial works and worthy kings. Pope. Introduction. Part 1. Since the appearance of this book in its original form, some 17 years since, the construction of railways has continued to make extraordinary progress. Although Great Britain, first in the field, had then, after about 25 years' work, expended nearly 300 million sterling in the construction of 8,300 miles of railway, it has, during the last 17 years, expended about 288 millions more in constructing 7,780 additional miles. But the construction of railways has proceeded with equal rapidity on the continent. France, Germany, Spain, Sweden, Belgium, Switzerland, Holland have largely added to their railway mileage. Austria is actively engaged in carrying new lines across the plains of Hungary, which Turkey is preparing to meet by lines carried up the valley of the lower Danube. Russia is also occupied with extensive schemes for connecting Petersburg and Moscow with her ports in the Black Sea on the one hand, and with the frontier towns of her Asiatic empire on the other. Italy is employing her newborn liberty in vigorously extending railways throughout her dominions. A direct line of communication has already been opened between France and Italy through the Mont-Cenis tunnel, while another has been opened between Germany and Italy through the Brenner Pass, so that the entire journey may now be made by two different railway routes, excepting only the short sea passage across the English Channel from London to Brindisi, situated in the southeastern extremity of the Italian peninsula. During the last 16 years, nearly the whole of the Indian railways have been made. When Edmund Burke, in 1783, arraigned the British government for their neglect of India in his speech on Mr. Fox's bill, he said, "England has built no bridges, made no high roads, cut no navigations, dug out no reservoirs. Were we to be driven out of India this day, nothing would remain to tell that it had been possessed, during the inglorious period of our dominion, by anything better than the orangutan or the tiger." But that reproach no longer exists. Some of the greatest bridges erected in modern times, such as those over the Soane near Patna and over the Jumna at Allahabad, have been erected in connection with the Indian railways. More than 5,000 miles are now at work, and they have been constructed at an expenditure of about £88 million of British capital, guaranteed by the British government. The Indian railways connect the capitals of the three presidencies, uniting Bombay with Madras on the south and with Calcutta on the northeast, while the Great Main Line, 2,200 miles in extent, passing through the northwestern provinces and connecting Calcutta with Lucknow, Delhi, Lahore, Multan and Karachi, unites the mouths of the Hooghly in the Bay of Bengal with those of the Indus in the Arabian Sea. When the first edition of this work appeared in the beginning of 1857, the Canadian system of railways was but in its infancy. The Grand Trunk was only begun, and the Victoria Bridge, the greatest of all railway structures, was not half erected. The colony of Canada has now more than 3,000 miles in active operation along the great valley of the St. Lawrence, connecting Riviera de Loup at the mouth of that river and the harbour of Portland in the state of Maine, via Montreal and Toronto, with Sarnia on Lake Huron, and with Windsor, opposite Detroit, in the state of Michigan. During the same time, the Australian colonies have been actively engaged in providing themselves with railways, many of which are at work, and others are in course of formation. The Cape of Good Hope has several lines open and others making. France has constructed about 400 miles in Algeria, while the Pasha of Egypt is the proprietor of 360 miles in operation across the Egyptian desert. The Japanese are also making railroads. But in no country has railway construction been prosecuted with greater vigour than in the United States. There, the railway furnishes not only the means of intercommunication between already established settlements, as in the Old World, but it is regarded as the pioneer of colonisation and as instrumental in opening up new and fertile territories of vast extent in the West, the food grounds of future nations. Hence, railway construction in that country was scarcely interrupted even by the Great Civil War, at the commencement of which Mr. Seward publicly expressed the opinion that physical bonds, such as highways, railroads, rivers and canals, are vastly more powerful for holding civil communities together than any mere covenants, though written on parchment or engraved on iron. The people of the United States were the first to follow the example of England, after the practicability of steam locomotion had been proved on the Stockton and Darlington and Liverpool and Manchester Railways. The first sod of the Baltimore and Ohio Railway was cut on the 4th of July 1828, and the line was completed and opened for traffic the following year, when it was worked partly by horsepower and partly by a locomotive built at Baltimore, which is still preserved in the company's workshops. In 1830, the Hudson and Mohawk Railway was begun, while other lines were under construction in Pennsylvania, Massachusetts and New Jersey, and in the course of 10 years, 1,843 miles were finished and in operation. In 10 more years, 8,827 miles were at work. At the end of 1864, 35,000 miles, and at the 31st of December 1873, not less than 70,651 miles were in operation, of which 3,916 had been made during that year. One of the most extensive trunk lines is the Great Pacific Railroad, connecting the lines in the valleys of the Mississippi and the Missouri with the city of San Francisco on the shores of the Pacific, by means of which it is possible to make the journey from England to Hong Kong via New York in little more than a month. The results of the working of railways have been in many respects different from those anticipated by their projectors. One of the most unexpected has been the growth of an immense passenger traffic. The Stockton and Darlington line was projected as a coal line only, and the Liverpool and Manchester as a merchandise line. Passengers were not taken into account as a source of revenue, for at the time of their projection it was not believed that people would trust themselves to be drawn upon a railway by an explosive machine, as the locomotive was described to be. Indeed, a writer of eminence declared that he would as soon think of being fired off on a ricochet rocket as travel on a railway at twice the speed of the old stagecoaches. So great was the alarm which existed as to the locomotive that the Liverpool and Manchester Committee pledged themselves in their second prospectus, issued in 1825, not to require any clause empowering its use, and as late as 1829 the Newcastle and Carlisle Act was conceded on the express condition that the line should not be worked by locomotives but by horses only. Nevertheless, the Liverpool and Manchester Company obtained powers to make and work their railway without any such restriction, and when the line was made and opened, a locomotive passenger train was advertised to be run upon it by way of experiment. Greatly to the surprise of the directors, more passengers presented themselves as travellers by the train than could conveniently be carried. The first arrangements as to passenger traffic were of a very primitive character, being mainly copied from the old stagecoach system. The passengers were booked at the railway office, and their names were entered in a waybill which was given to the guard when the train started. Though the usual stagecoach bugleman could not conveniently accompany the passengers, the trains were at first played out of the terminal stations by a lively tune performed by a trumpeter at the end of the platform, and this continued to be done at the Manchester station until a comparatively recent date. But the number of passengers carried by the Liverpool and Manchester line was so unexpectedly great that it was very soon found necessary to remodel the entire system. which a great saving of time was effected. More roomy and commodious carriages were provided, the original first-class compartments being seated for 4 passengers only. Everything was found to have been in the first instance made too light and too slight. The prize rocket, which weighed only 4.5 tons when loaded with its coke and water, was found quite unsuited for drawing the increasingly heavy loads of passengers. There was also this essential difference between the old stagecoach and the new railway train, that whereas the former was full with 6 inside and 10 outside, the latter must be able to accommodate whatever number of passengers came to be carried. Hence, heavier and more powerful engines and larger and more substantial carriages were from time to time added to the carrying stock of the railway. The speed of the trains was also increased. The first locomotive, used in hauling coal trains, ran at from 4 to 6 miles an hour. On the Stockton and Darlington line, the speed was increased to about 10 miles an hour. And on the Liverpool and Manchester line, the first passenger trains were run at the average speed of 17 miles an hour, which at that time was considered very fast. But this was not enough. When the London and Birmingham line was opened, the mail trains were run at 23 miles an hour, and gradually the speed went up until now the fast trains are run at from 50 to 60 miles an hour. The pistons in the cylinders at 60 miles, travelling at the inconceivable rapidity of 800 feet per minute. To bear the load of heavy engines run at high speed, a much stronger and heavier road was found necessary, and shortly after the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester line, it was entirely relaid with stronger materials. Now that express passenger engines are from 30 to 35 tons each, the weight of the rails has been increased from 35 pounds to 75 pounds or 86 pounds to the yard. Stone blocks have given place to wooden sleepers, rails with loose ends resting on the chairs to rails with their ends firmly fished together, and in many places where the traffic is unusually heavy, iron rails have been replaced by those of steel. And now see the enormous magnitude to which railway passenger traffic has grown. In the year 1873, 401,465,086 passengers were carried by day tickets in Great Britain alone. But this was not all, for in that year 257,470 periodical tickets were issued by the different railways, and assuming half of them to be annual, 1/4 half-yearly and the remainder quarterly tickets, and that their holders made only 5 journeys each way weekly, this would give an additional number of 47,024,000 journeys, or a total of 448,489,086 passengers carried in Great Britain in 1 year. It is difficult to grasp the idea of the enormous number of persons represented by these figures. The mind is merely bewildered by them, and can form no adequate notion of their magnitude. To reckon them singly would occupy 25 years, counting at the rate of 1 a second, for 12 hours every day. Or take another illustration. Supposing every man, woman and child in Great Britain to make 10 journeys by rail yearly, the number would greatly fall short of the passengers carried in 1873. Mr. Porter, in his Progress of the Nation, estimated that 30 millions of passengers, or about 82,000 a day, travelled by coaches in Great Britain in 1834, an average distance of 12 miles each, at an average cost of 5 shillings a passenger, or at the rate of 5 pence a mile. Whereas above 448 millions are now carried by railway, an average distance of 8.5 miles each, at an average cost of 1 shilling 1.5 pence per passenger, or about 3 halfpence per mile, in considerably less than 1/4 of the time. But besides the above numbers of passengers, over 162 million tons of minerals and merchandise were carried by railway in the United Kingdom in 1873, besides mails, cattle, parcels and other traffic. The distance run by passenger and goods trains in the year was 162,561,304 miles, to accomplish which it is estimated that 4 miles of railway must have been covered by running trains during every second all the year round. To perform this service there were, in 1873, 11,255 locomotives at work in the United Kingdom, consuming about 4 million tonnes of coal and coke, and flashing into the air every minute some 40 tonnes of water in the form of steam in a high state of elasticity. There were also 24,644 passenger carriages, 9,128 vans and brakes attached to passenger trains, and 329,163 trucks, wagons and other vehicles appropriated to merchandise. Buckled together, buffer to buffer, the locomotives and tenders would extend from London to Peterborough, while the carrying vehicles, joined together, would form two trains occupying a double line of railway extending from London to beyond Inverness. A notable feature in the growth of railway traffic of late years has been the increase in the number of third-class passengers compared with first and second class. 16 years since, the third-class passengers constituted only about one-third. 10 years later, they were about one-half, whereas now they form more than three-fourths of the whole number carried. In 1873, there were about 23 million first-class passengers, 62 million second-class, and not less than 306 million third-class. Thus, George Stephenson's prediction that the time would come when it would be cheaper for a working man to make a journey by railway than to walk on foot is already verified. The degree of safety with which this great traffic has been conducted is not the least remarkable of its features. Of course, so long as railways are worked by men, they will be liable to the imperfection belonging to all things human. Though their machinery may be perfect and their organisation as complete as skill and forethought can make it, workmen will at times be forgetful and listless, and a moment's carelessness may lead to the most disastrous results. Yet, taking all circumstances into account, the wonder is that travelling by railway at high speed should have been rendered comparatively so safe. To be struck by lightning is one of the rarest of all causes of death, yet more persons are killed by lightning in Great Britain than are killed on railways from causes beyond their own control. Most persons would consider the probability of their dying by hanging to be extremely remote, yet according to the Registrar General's returns, it is considerably greater than that of being killed by railway accident. The remarkable safety with which railway traffic is on the whole concluded is due to constant watchfulness and highly applied skill. The men who work the railways are for the most part the picked men of the country, and every railway station may be regarded as a practical school of industry, attention and punctuality. Few are aware of the complicated means and agencies that are in constant operation on railways day and night to ensure the safety of the passengers to their journey's end. The road is under a system of continuous inspection. The railway is watched by foremen with gangs of men under them, in lengths varying from 12 to 5 miles according to circumstances. Their continuous duty is to see that the rails and chairs are sound, their fastenings complete, and the line clear of all obstructions. Then, at all the junctions, sidings and crossings, pointsmen are stationed, with definite instructions as to the duties to be performed by them. At these places, signals are provided, worked from the station platforms, or from special signal boxes, for the purpose of protecting the stopping or passing trains. When the first railways were opened, the signals were of a very simple kind. The station men gave them with their arms stretched out in different positions. Then flags of different colours were used. Next, fixed signals with arms or discs of rectangular or triangular shape. These were followed by a complete system of semaphore signals, near and distant, protecting all junctions, sidings and crossings. When government inspectors were first appointed by the Board of Trade to examine and report upon the workings of railways, they were alarmed by the number of trains following each other at some stations in what seemed to be a very rapid succession. A passage from a report written in 1840 by Sir Frederick Smith as to the traffic at Taylor's Junction on the York and North Midland Railway contrasts curiously with the railway life and activity of the present day. Here, wrote the alarmed inspector, the passenger trains from York as well as from Leeds and Selby meet 4 times a day. No less than 23 passenger trains stop at or pass this station in the 21 hours, an amount of traffic requiring not only the utmost perfect arrangements on the part of the management, but the utmost vigilance and energy in the servants of the company employed at this place. Contrast this with the state of things now. On the Metropolitan line, 667 trains pass a given point in one direction or the other during the 18 hours of the working day, or an average of 36 trains an hour. At the Cannon Street station of the South Eastern Railway, 627 trains pass in and out daily, many of them crossing each other's tracks under the protection of the station's signals. 45 trains run in and out between 9 and 10 a.m, and an equal number between 4 and 5 p.m. Again, at the Clapham Junction near London, about 700 trains pass or stop daily, and though to the casual observer the succession of trains coming and going, running and stopping, coupling and shunting, appears a scene of inextricable confusion and danger, the whole is clearly intelligible to the signal men in their boxes, who work the trains in and out with extraordinary precision and regularity. The inside of a signal box reminds one of a pianoforte on a large scale, the lever handles corresponding with the keys of the instrument, and to an uninstructed person, to work the one would be as difficult as to play a tune on the other. The signal box outside Cannon Street station contains 67 lever handles, by means of which the signalmen are enabled at the same moment to communicate with the drivers of all the engines on the line within an area of 800 yards. They direct by signs which are quite as intelligible as words the drivers of the trains starting from inside the station, as well as those of the trains arriving from outside. By pulling a lever handle, a distant signal, perhaps out of sight, is set some 100 yards off, which the approaching driver, reading it quickly as he comes along, at once interprets and stops or advances as the signal may direct. The precision and accuracy of the signal machinery employed at important stations and junctions have of late years been much improved by an ingenious contrivance by means of which the setting of the signal prepares the road for the coming train. When the signal is set at danger, the points are at the same time worked, and the road is locked against it, and when at safety, the road is open, the signal and the points exactly corresponding. The electric telegraph has also been found a valuable auxiliary in ensuring the safe working of large railway traffics. Though the locomotive may run at 60 miles an hour, electricity, when at its fastest, travels at the rate of 288,000 miles a second, and is therefore always able to herald the coming train. The electric telegraph may, indeed, be regarded as the nervous system of the railway. By its means the whole line is kept throbbing with intelligence. The method of working the electric signals varies on different lines, but the usual practice is to divide a line into so many lengths, each protected by its signal stations. The fundamental law of telegraph working being that two engines are not allowed to run on the same line between two signal stations at the same time. When a train passes one of such stations, it is immediately signalled on, usually by electric signal bells, to the station in advance, and that interval of railway is blocked until the signal has been received from the station in advance that the train has passed it. Thus an interval of space is always secured between trains following each other, which are thereby alike protected before and behind. And thus, when a train starts on a journey, it may be hundreds of miles, it is signalled on from station to station. It lives along the line, until at length it reaches its destination, and the last signal of "train in" is given. By this means an immense number of trains can be worked with regularity and safety. On the South Eastern Railway, where the system has been brought to a state of high efficiency, it is no unusual thing during Easter week to send 600,000 passengers through the London Bridge station alone, and on some days as many as 1,200 trains a day. While such are the expedients adopted to ensure safety, others, equally ingenious, are adopted to ensure speed. In the case of express and mail trains, the frequent stopping of the engines to take in a fresh supply of water occasions a considerable loss of time on a long journey, each stoppage for this purpose occupying from 10 to 15 minutes. To avoid such stoppages, larger tenders have been provided, capable of carrying as much as 2000 gallons of water each; but as a considerable time is occupied in filling these, a plan has been contrived by Mr. Ramsbottom, the locomotive engineer of the London and North Western Railway, by which the engines are made to feed themselves while running at full speed. The plan is as follows: an open trough, about 440 feet long, is laid longitudinally between the rails. Into this trough, which is filled by water, a dip pipe or scoop attached to the bottom of the tender of the running train is lowered, and at a speed of 50 miles an hour as much as 1070 gallons of water are scooped up in the course of a few minutes. The first of such troughs was laid down between Chester and Holyhead, to enable the express mail to run the distance of 841 miles in 2 hours and 5 minutes without stopping; and similar troughs have since been laid down at Bushey, near London, at Castlethorpe, near Wolverton, and at Parkside, near Liverpool. At these 4 troughs about 130,000 gallons of water are scooped up daily. Wherever railways have been made, new towns have sprung up, and old towns and cities have been quickened into new life. When the first English lines were projected, great were the prophecies of disaster to the inhabitants of the districts through which they were proposed to be forced. Such fears have long since been dispelled in this country. The same prejudices existed in France. When the railway from Paris to Marseilles was laid out so as to pass through Lyons, a local prophet predicted that if the line were made the city would be ruined, ville traversée, ville perdue; while a local priest denounced the locomotive and the electric telegraph as heralding the reign of Antichrist. But such nonsense is no longer uttered. Now it is the city without the railway that is regarded as the city lost, for it is in a measure shut out from the rest of the world, and left outside the pale of civilization. End of Introduction, Part 1.